courtroom, once buzzing with noise, fell silent as the heavy wooden doors swung open. Officer Eric Marshall, a decorated yet controversial member of the local police department, strode in with an air of arrogant confidence. His crisp uniform was immaculate as he swept a disdainful gaze across the room, just as he often did with those he deemed beneath him. But today, the one under scrutiny was him, though Marshall didn't seem to take it seriously. The charge: civil rights violations stemming from a routine traffic stop. The plaintiff? Terrence Williams, a young black teacher who had filed a lawsuit after being arrested under dubious circumstances. Marshall had claimed Terrence resisted arrest when in reality, he had merely asked why he was being pulled over. The incident sparked outrage within the local community when a bystander's video surfaced, revealing Marshall shouting slurs and forcefully pinning Terrence to the ground without justification. As Marshall took his seat at the defendant's table, his attorney whispered something to him, but he barely paid attention. His focus was on the woman sitting at the judge's bench. She was black. She sat with authority, her black robe neatly draped over her shoulders, her face unreadable. Marshall's smirk faltered for just a moment before he muttered under his breath, "Well, this should be interesting." He didn't expect much from this trial. To him, this was just another overreaction from a fragile community and a biased legal system. He had walked away from worse situations before. What was the worst that could happen? Court is now in session. The clerk's voice rang out as Judge Evelyn Lawson spoke firmly. "I am Judge Evelyn Lawson, presiding over this trial. Let's begin." Let's begin. Marshall crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. He had nothing to fear. But the sharp look in Judge Lawson's eyes, brief but deliberate, hinted that he was about to face something he hadn't prepared for. And so the trial began. The prosecutor, a young attorney named Anthony Delgado, stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. On the night of March 8th, Terrence Williams, a respected teacher and mentor to local youth, was pulled over by Officer Marshall under the claim of a broken taillight. Within seconds of Mr. Williams simply asking why he had been stopped, he was forcibly removed from his vehicle, handcuffed, and arrested under baseless charges. Delgado paused, scanning the jury before continuing. More than that, a bystander's video clearly captures Officer Marshall using language that can only be described as racially motivated. The courtroom held its breath as those words echoed. A few jurors leaned forward, now fully engaged. Delgado pressed on. This was not an isolated incident. Officer Marshall has a documented history of questionable arrests, over 75% of them targeting black and brown individuals in this city. Today we will prove that Mr. Williams' rights were violated, not due to legitimate law enforcement, but because of personal bias. The air in the courtroom grew heavy, thick like smoke. At the defense table, Marshall let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head before leaning toward his attorney and whispering, "This guy's dramatic. They're blowing this way out of proportion." His lawyer, Richard Palmer, a seasoned attorney, gave him a sharp look. "Keep quiet and let me handle this." From the judge's bench, Judge Lawson's eyes flickered toward Marshall once more. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, an unwavering resolve. She tapped her pen lightly against the desk as Prosecutor Delgado presented his first piece of evidence, the bystander's video. The courtroom dimmed as the footage played on the large screen. The image appeared, Terrence Williams standing outside his car, his hands raised in compliance. Marshall's voice rang out, loud and clear. "I don't care what you have to say. Get on the ground, now." Terrence's voice calm but confused. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. Why are you treating me like this?" Then came the sound of a scuffle, Marshall shoving Terrence to the ground, aggressively cuffing him. And then, the words that echoed through the courtroom. "You people think you can talk back to me? Not a chance." A stunned silence filled the room. Gasps, whispers. A few jurors shook their heads in disbelief. The trial had just begun, but the weight of that moment had already changed everything. Marshall rolled his eyes at the reaction and muttered, "Overly sensitive." But this time, his smirk slowly faded. Judge Lawson leaned forward, her voice sharp as a blade. Officer Marshall. The courtroom fell silent. Would you like to explain your choice of words in this video? Marshall froze. His attorney quickly stood up, cutting in. Your Honor, the defense will address this during cross-examination. I request. I wasn't asking you, Mr. Palmer. Judge Lawson's voice was cold and authoritative. I want to hear the answer from Officer Marshall. For the first time, Marshall looked uncertain. His eyes darted around the room, and the arrogance he once carried began to crack. I don't recall the exact context of that moment, Your Honor. Judge Lawson narrowed her eyes. Interesting. Then you'll have plenty of time to remember as this trial continues. A murmur spread through the courtroom as she leaned back, her gaze still locked onto Marshall. The trial was turning more intense than expected. Prosecutor Delgado presented the data. Out of 237 traffic stops by Officer Marshall, 184 involved black or brown drivers, more than 77%. Despite these groups making up less than 35% of the population, the jury stirred. Delgado continued, 128 arrests. 110 were dismissed, or resulted in no conviction, an 86% dismissal rate. This isn't a coincidence. This is a clear bias. Officer Marshall scowled and muttered to his attorney, "This is a joke." Judge Lawson cut in coldly, "If you have something to say it out loud." Marshall stiffened, then mumbled, "Nothing, Your Honor." Then, Terrence Williams took the witness stand. Steady and composed, he recounted, "I pulled over as instructed, greeted Officer Marshall, and asked for the reason. He didn't answer, just ordered me out of the car. When I asked again, he became aggressive." Terrence described how Marshall grabbed him, slammed him onto the hood, and handcuffed him without explanation. His voice tightened. He said, "You people need to learn some respect." The courtroom went silent. When asked how he felt, Terrence took a deep breath, preparing his response. "I felt humiliated, degraded. I've spent my life teaching kids to believe in the justice system, to respect authority. But in that moment, I realized that to some people, the only thing they see is the color of my skin." Delgado nodded and stepped back. "Thank you, Mr. Williams. No further questions." As Terrence stepped down, Marshall leaned toward his attorney again. "He's exaggerating everything," he hissed. "None of that happened the way he said." Judge Lawson raised an eyebrow. "Officer Marshall, do you have anything you'd like to clarify?" Marshall swallowed hard, his usual arrogance wavering. "No, Your Honor." The corner of Judge Lawson's mouth curled into a brief, knowing smile. "Very well, let's proceed." Clearly, this trial was not going the way Marshall had expected. Judge Lawson's piercing gaze never left him, as if she was waiting for just the right moment to deliver the final blow. Tension thickened in the courtroom as the prosecutor called the next witness, Dr. Danica Mercer, an expert in criminal justice. With an air of authority, she commanded respect the moment she stepped onto the stand. "Dr. Mercer, you've reviewed Officer Marshall's records. Can you summarize your findings?" Delgado asked. She nodded. "The data shows a clear pattern of racial profiling. He stops and arrests black drivers at 3 times the rate of his colleagues, even when controlling for other factors." Delgado stepped closer. "What does that mean?" "It indicates a consistent bias," she replied. "Whether conscious or not, Officer Marshall has been targeting black individuals. This is not an isolated incident, it's a recurring problem." Marshall scoffed, but Judge Lawson immediately issued a warning. "If you cannot maintain proper decorum, I will have you removed." Delgado pressed on. "What are the consequences of this behavior?" "It erodes trust in law enforcement, especially within minority communities, creating fear and resentment." The defense attorney attempted to counter, suggesting this could be a mere coincidence. But Dr. Mercer's response was firm. "Bias doesn't have to be intentional to be harmful. The data doesn't lie." The jury listened intently. As she stepped down from the stand, Judge Lawson announced a 15-minute recess. Marshall clenched his fists, hissing at his lawyer, "They're against me." The lawyer sighed. "You're not helping yourself, Eric." The trial resumed with the next witness, Officer Anthony Rivera, Marshall's colleague. With his reputation for integrity, His testimony could be the biggest threat to Marshall. Rivera hesitated, glancing at Marshall, who was glaring at him. Taking a deep breath, he said, "Yes, I have witnessed troubling behavior." Marshall was known for targeting minority drivers and making discriminatory remarks. "In what way?" Delgado asked. Rivera's voice was firm. He said they didn't belong in certain neighborhoods, calling traffic stops, teaching them a lesson. The courtroom murmured. Marshall slammed the table in anger. "Silence, Officer Marshall." Judge Lawson said sternly, "One more outburst and you will be held in contempt of court." Rivera continued, "No one dared to question Marshall because of his connections with superiors. But the Terrence Williams case was the last straw. It wasn't just wrong, it was unacceptable." The defense attorney tried to recover. Could it be that Officer Marshall was simply maintaining order? Rivera replied bluntly, "Enforcing the law is not the same as being biased." The court adjourned. As Marshall stormed out, he hissed, "This is a setup." His lawyer sighed. "You brought this on yourself." The next morning, the trial resumed. Judge Lawson spoke firmly, "We will now proceed with closing arguments." Delgado stepped toward the jury, his voice unwavering. "This is not a misunderstanding, it is an abuse of power. Terrence Williams did nothing wrong, yet he was assaulted simply because of his skin color. If we fail to punish this behavior, what message are we sending?" He stepped back, his tone softer but still weighty. "Justice demands that we stand up today. Thank you." The room fell silent as Delgado returned to his seat. All eyes turned to the defense attorney, who slowly stood and approached the jury, his expression solemn. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client, Officer Marshall, has spent years serving this community. Law enforcement is not an easy job, and sometimes decisions must be made in the blink of an eye, under difficult circumstances. While the events of that night were unfortunate, they do not reflect intentional racial bias or a violation of civil rights." He paused, letting his words settle. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Officer Marshall is a villain, but the reality is far more complex. Mistakes happen, and misunderstandings occur. We cannot be so quick to turn those who risk their lives daily to protect us into criminals." Returning to his seat, the lawyer glanced at Marshall, who gave him a stiff nod. The jury remained unreadable, deep in thought over the arguments presented. Judge Lawson scanned the courtroom before speaking. "Before we adjourn, I have a few words." Marshall shifted in his seat, clearly losing confidence. Judge Lawson's gaze rested on him. "This case is not just about a traffic stop. It is about justice and equality. As an officer, your duty is to protect, not to oppress." She looked at the jury. "Deliberate carefully. Justice must be fair." She struck the gavel. "Court is adjourned." Marshall shot up from his seat, furious. "This is ridiculous. A witch hunt." Judge Lawson responded coolly, "Watch your words, Officer Marshall. You are no longer above accountability." Outside, Terrence Williams waited. The length of jury deliberation kept everyone on edge. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. Has the jury reached a verdict? "We find the defendant guilty." Terrence exhaled, and his family embraced each other. Marshall jumped up in rage, but officers restrained him. Judge Lawson declared, "No one is above the law." Terrence felt a weight lift. Justice, though delayed, had prevailed. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. Judge Lawson addressed them solemnly, "Have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreperson stood. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom buzzed. Terrence sighed in relief as his family hugged one another. On the other side, Officer Marshall shot up, furious, shouting that the trial was a sham. Judge Lawson silenced the room. "Before I pass the sentence, I will give the defendant an opportunity to speak. Officer Marshall, do you have anything to say?" Marshall hesitated, glancing at his attorney, who gave him a knowing signal. Slowly he stood up, cleared his throat, and spoke in a restrained voice that still carried traces of resentment. "Ma, I want to say that I have served this community for over 17 years. I have put my life on the line for the people of this city, and while I may have made mistakes, I believe this trial is unfair. I have been made out to be a villain simply for doing my job, and I have upheld my record." Judge Lawson narrowed her eyes slightly but allowed him to finish. Marshall continued, his tone growing more defensive. I am not a racist, and I do not deserve to be treated this way. I have worked hard to keep this city safe, and I believe that those who know me understand that. He sank back into his seat, folding his arms across his chest. His attorney grimaced at his unapologetic speech, but there was nothing to be done now. Judge Lawson took a deep breath before speaking. Her voice was calm, yet carried an undeniable authority. Officer Marshall, your statement says a lot not about your service, but about who you are. Not once have you taken responsibility for your actions. You have shown no remorse for the harm you have caused to Mr. Williams or the community you swore to protect. Instead, you remain arrogant and evade accountability at every turn. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. You call yourself a protector of this community, yet your actions have eroded trust in law enforcement and reinforced the very divisions you should have helped mend. Your years of service do not excuse your misconduct. If anything, they make it even more serious. The courtroom fell silent, each of her words landing with weight. Judge Lawson continued. Justice is not about revenge, Officer Marshall. It is about responsibility. And today this court will ensure that you are held accountable. Tension thickened in the room as she prepared to deliver the sentence. Marshall, though trying to maintain his composure, could not hide his unease. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Lawson pronounced the verdict: 18 months in federal prison, revocation of his officer certification, 300 hours of community service, and a public apology from Marshall. The words federal prison and revocation of certification struck him hard, shattering his arrogance. As he protested, the judge's voice turned ice cold. Sit down. Her tone made it clear this was not just a punishment but a statement that no one was above the law. In the back of the courtroom, Terrence Williams, embraced by his family, knew that justice had prevailed. Marshall was led away, carrying the weight of his abused power. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers, holding up signs that read, "Justice for all." Terrence, overwhelmed by the support, felt a hand on his shoulder. His attorney, Delgado. "You've done enough," Delgado said. "Let the verdict speak for itself." Inside her office, Judge Lawson gazed at the gavel, deep in thought. Delgado entered, thanking her for the ruling. She offered a small smile. "Justice is never easy," she said, "but it is always necessary." In the days that followed, the story of Terrence Williams and Officer Marshall spread, igniting debates about police accountability. The video of Marshall being handcuffed and escorted out of court went viral, becoming a symbol of justice. Terrence returned to teaching, his students looking at him like a hero. When asked if he had any regrets, he simply replied, "No. Because doing the right thing isn't about feeling comfortable, it's about making sure others don't have to go through what I did." Marshall, now in prison, was forced to face the consequences of his actions. He resisted the bias training sessions, but over time, the cracks in his arrogance began to show. Whether he would change was uncertain, but his unchecked power had come to an end. On the courthouse steps, the community erected a plaque honoring Terrence with the words, "Justice is not given, it must be fought for." His story became a reminder that justice can prevail when people have the courage to stand up and fight. In the end, Terrence Williams' story serves as a powerful lesson. Justice is never automatic, it demands courage and struggle. Injustice only thrives when people choose to remain silent. In 2025, we must take action now, speak out against injustice, educate the next generation about equality, support those who fight for what is right, and demand real reform in the legal and law enforcement systems. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to change. Looking ahead to 2030, will racism still exist? That depends on what we do today. If we all raise our voices and take action, perhaps one day justice and equality will no longer be something to fight for, but a natural part of society. You may not be Terrence Williams, but you can amplify the voices of those like him. Justice will prevail when we all stand together. This story is entirely fictional and created to raise awareness. It highlights issues of accountability, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.